Hi, I'm Bill Scott. A short time ago, Nick Heap asked a simple but really provocative question. He said, "What if we changed the conversation about coronavirus?" And he put out two or three questions based in appreciative inquiry. And I got very intrigued by his thinking. And so I contacted him. And he said, "Let's try an experiment. We'll interview one another using these questions and see what happens. And then maybe we'll put them out there for others to see, and perhaps they can use these questions too." So that's what we did. I hope you like what we came up with.
Hello. Um, the coronavirus seems to be causing a lot of misery and despair. People feeling hopeless, powerless, frightened, stuck, um, wondering what's going to happen. And just lately, I've been thinking, well, maybe we can change the conversation about coronavirus by just simply changing the questions that we ask. I've no idea if it's going to work or not. So Bill is going to ask me a few questions and see what happens. Over to you. Over to you, Bill. Oh, but sorry, and finally, if this works and you like the idea, then maybe you might like to try this approach with a friend of yours. We'll append some of the questions to somewhere to this video, either in the comments or somewhere. I'm not a techie, but Bill's daughter is a techie, and apparently she will do this brilliantly. So never do something you can get somebody else to do. It's a motto of mine.
Well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you, Nick. I really do appreciate it. And we definitely will make sure that people have access to the questions we're using if they want to use them themselves. So you've been through challenging times before. Can you tell your story about one where you came through it triumphantly, where you had just immense success? What helped you do so? Let's start there.
Right. Well, uh, yeah, one of the challenging times I had was that more years ago that I can actually think of. I had a training experience which was very powerful, which made me realize that the job I had, which was actually as a scientist, although it was enjoyable and I was, I think, quite good at it, and it potentially might have some benefit, it really wasn't addressing what I'd learned was a really significant issue that's going to make a difference to our survival as a species. And that simply was that, we need to have a society which is based on love, not fear and greed. And the practical way in which you show love is by listening. It is as simple as that. So if we have more listening in the world, in the end, we can solve all the problems we have. So this was a long way said. This was 1970, and I had this realization, and there I was, a scientist in a big chemical company. Luckily, it was quite a progressive chemical company. But then I had to think about how on earth am I going to be able to make this, how on earth I'm going to make this transition. So first of all, I was really, really clear that I needed to move into something that involved working with people. I wasn't quite sure what it was. And the second thing I realized was that I needed to prove to ICI that I was actually serious about this change. They wouldn't just say, I needed to prove to them I was serious. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'll do some of my own time. So I spent a year as a Samaritan, where I was basically listening to people who were suicidal, and that involved some training and development. Good, but you were spending an awful lot of time waiting for the phone to ring or waiting for people to come in. And in the end, after a year, I thought, no, I'm not sure I really, this is really right for me. So I trained as a relate counsellor. Well, it was called marriage guidance then. And for 4 years, I was, as a volunteer, I was working with couples, sometimes who'd been hating each other for a very long time. And I really got to know them in depth, and the training was extraordinarily good. I got to know myself and developed skills. That was part of it. I applied for jobs through ICI, and if I didn't get them, I never complained. I would just simply say, I didn't get it. So what do I need to learn, or what do I need to do in order to be more successful next time? I talked to people in the company all the time, and I got befriended particularly by a couple of people who would just help me think it through. And after 4 years of persistent, flexible sort of struggle and trying stuff and seeing what happened, I eventually was interviewed for a job in the south of England. And I absolutely had my wits about me at that interview situation, because it was it was an assessment centre. And I remember very vividly now, this was a very long time ago, there were the candidates were sitting round a table, and there were 3 sort of assessors around the outside. And they said to us, right, so you spend the next hour talking about whatever you think would be appropriate. And in 30 seconds, I said, well, it seems to me that we've heard a little bit about the company, so why don't we talk about what we do if we got this job that would actually help the company? And everybody said yes, and we did it. And I did listen. I didn't take over, and I showed leadership in that situation, and eventually got the job. So that's my story, and I had 6 years of absolute freedom to do whatever I could get away with that was likely to be helpful in that job. And I was trained by them for equivalent of half a day a week for 6 years. That was on off-site training. I added it all up.
So that was an enormous career transition for you at a formative time of your life. And I'm kind of wondering what kinds of skills and strengths and resiliency you drew on to make that happen for you, to leave, I'm imagining, a well-paying job in the chemical industry to the great unknown.
Well, it was the same company, so it wasn't a question of leaving the company. And the company was very, very supportive place. I mean, they positively encouraged people to switch from one discipline to another if it was at all possible. So it was an extremely accommodating company. Well, I think I never really wavered from the fact that this was a goal. In the developed training experience, the T group I was in, I didn't feel as though I actually had any choice about this. It was something which I was compelled to do. It was not, as I explained to you earlier before we started this call, it didn't feel like it was even a calling. It felt like it was an instruction. Mm-hmm. I had no choice, actually. This was what was going to happen. And I suppose that, that was a sort of two-edged gift. It was definitely a gift. It helped. So I was really, really determined. And I would learn as I would try things, and if it didn't work, I would sit and think and try again. Mm. And I kept talking to people. And they were very lucky. Luckily, there were lots and lots of people around, managing the organisation who would actually listen to me. And the more I talked about it, the clearer it got. And I had new thoughts. And I made mistakes, and that was all right. Mm.
So it sounds like you had a fair amount of support from the people around you. I'm wondering what other things they did that helped to make this a real peak experience for you.
Well, the other part of the transition process was that I had the opportunity as a volunteer to work in a little sort of cross, sort of a diagonal sort of little task force of people. There were issues about career development in the lab where I was working, because there were lots of young folks coming mostly a lot from being directly recruited with PhDs, possibly been to the States for a couple of years on a postdoc. But they were sort of individual yeah, they were sort of individual prima donnas, really, which was part of the reason for the training. But what used to happen was these people would be, in the old days, these people would be told when you leave in 5 years, because you were going here. People were moved around on the chessboard, and that was terribly unsatisfactory, both for the organisation and for the individuals. And I volunteered for a group to work on a better way of doing it, and we came up with a system of actually setting up some people in the organisation to be internal career counsellors, which were helping people figure out what they really wanted to do and what they could do, and to take power to get it to happen. And so the management didn't have to do much at all. So it's much better for them. And it was really interesting for me because it was an OD thing, and I got the job, or volunteered for the job actually, to write the report where they had to say yes to what we proposed. And my Brian, who was my boss, was very subtle, and he said, "Well, don't do too polished a job, Nick. Let's go around and sort of say to people." And so we went around to people who had to say yes to it and said, "Oh, sir, this is my please cast your wise eyes over at my humble offering and suggest ways in which it could be better, because I know it's woefully inadequate. This is all a sort of caricature." And of course they read it and they made improvements. And then when we presented it back to the group, it wasn't ours anymore, it was theirs.
Right.
Even if they knew what we were doing, which I think they did, it still works.
Mm-hmm. So being able to allow people the opportunity to take something and create a sense of ownership about it was helpful as well.
Yes, it was, and it was very exhilarating, and that, I think, possibly gave me some credibility when it came to making the transition in the end, because I was practicing what I wanted to do in a small way. Yeah, which is a bit of I suppose, a model of what you need to do when you get stuck.
So as we're recording this, it's the end of May 2020, and appreciative inquiry based questions always like to transport people into the future. So I want you to imagine rather, that it's 2 years into the future, and we've come through this COVID-19 crisis very, very well indeed. How did that happen?
I think one of the things that happened was that there was a movement, maybe not a terribly visible movement. There was a movement. There were enough people around who realized that the old normal wasn't normal. That the old normal, which involved people being persuaded that they had to go to work to earn lots of money to buy things they didn't need, and then to make those things that weren't needed actually ended up with polluting the planet and making the air dirty and making people ill. And the people who bought the things didn't have time to enjoy them anyway because they were so busy working. That this was actually a way of creating lots of stress for lots of people, and nobody was benefiting, apart from the very, very few people at the top who were addicted to money and have more money than they can possibly spend anyway. So a lot of people thought, well, this isn't really a sensible way of living. A lot of people said, let's have a planetary reset. So I think, yeah, what happened was that a movement was created. It started off informal and very sort of hidden, but a lot of people were actually starting to vote with their feet. And of course there were examples of good practices which were forced by the lockdowns. I mean, people were saying, look, I can work from home. Why should I be spending 3 hours a day commuting, wasting my time sitting in the crowded train, being more likely to be exposed to infection and it being thoroughly unpleasant, when actually I could spend more time with my family and kids, have a leisurely breakfast, walk down the stairs, and do my work just as well using this wonderful tech. So that was part of the way in which we came out of it. There was much more debate about the final debate, which is, what sort of life, what are people for? What do we want? I don't think until now, 2022, when in the last couple of years, as we've come through this mess, we've actually had a debate worldwide about what sort of world do we want? Mm. And, in brackets, I've asked people, perfect strangers, before now, tell me, what sort of world would you like your great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, to inherit? And give me the answer in just 2 words. They don't always come up with the same words, but they always describe the same world. Yeah. Because we're all members of the same species. We're literally all members of the same family, and clearly we want the same things. Nobody says that what we want is injustice and inequality and oppression. People say they want justice and peace and calmness and equality, and equality sometimes, and enough to eat and love and sanitation and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a grand vision, and I'm wondering what it is that you did, and also the corollary. What did other people do to start to move in that direction?
Well, what happened was we started talking about it. We started asking the question, what sort of world do you want? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily you, but I mean, what sort of world do you want the next generation to inherit? We're actually on a cusp now. Coronavirus is really stopping us in the tracks and stopped us in our tracks and given us the chance to think about what do we want. And we basically have a choice. We're going towards hell or heaven. You could argue hell or heaven are projections. Hell is global warming, a planet with the average temperature 50 degrees where people cannot live. And heaven is calm and peace and gentleness and less stuff and more happiness. What we realized as well is when you ask people, tell me a story about a time when you were happy, they never ever talk about the time when they picked up the new BMW. Even though picking up a new BMW might be very nice, they always talk about when I saw my child start to walk, a family event, a sunset, walking in the countryside. And when you ask about times when they made somebody else happy, it's nearly always something really, really simple. What's happened is we've seen the myths which we've been corrupted by, which have not been done, I think, deliberately by anybody, but the myths that we've been corrupted by, we've seen them.
So when you think about that environment where people have come to the realization that change needs to be made and that you've been able to help make that happen, how does it make you feel?
Well, it makes me feel, I suppose, justified, really, that I've justified my existence. I'm well aware of how privileged I've been in my life. You know, I've lived in a peaceful country for 70 years. Probably the most privileged generation has ever been, certainly in Britain, because you know we had free education, we had housing we could afford. We've had the only wars that have been involved in have been fought by professional soldiers, and very few of them, luckily. You know, it's a relatively well-governed country. It's law-abiding. It's very beautiful. My parents gave me a really, really good start by encouraging me to think. I had lots of people who really loved me and supported me in my life, particularly since I started working. And I've it sounds grandiose, but I think I have some gifts and I have a duty to use them. And I feel great if I've used them. If I could make so even a small nudge in this direction of a rational world, I mean, I want to do it.
Right. So staying with this kind of vision of the world 2 years from now, how has it, your community, your happiness changed as a result?
Well, I think I've said how the world's changed. Have I changed? I think I've become perhaps more peaceful, which is good. And the community, I think the way in which we got action to happen sort of worldwide on this was by whole loads of community actions. If you think about the range of skills and connections that you have even in a very small community, it's huge. If you could actually harness them and say, you know, in a small community, who do you know? What do you know? What skills have you got? Who can you influence? You know, where can we sow seeds? Imagine that happening all over. Imagine even communities modelling it. Maybe you don't have to wait for the whole world to change. Maybe you can change. Maybe small communities can change and be an exemplar.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I haven't done community mobilisation. I don't know how to do it, but there will be people who do.
It's a marvelous vision of where you'd love to see the world be when it comes out of the COVID crisis. What's one small thing you will do now that can help us come through the crisis well?
I mean, I do a lot of co-counselling, which is where I take turns listening to people and being listened to by them. And maybe one thing I do is to talk this through and see if I can come out with even more concrete actions. I don't know. I mean, all I do know is that I've really enjoyed it and I feel much better now.
Terrific. Thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with me, Nick. I really do appreciate it. And I love your vision of where we are 2 years from now.
This is a bit of an experiment, Bill, to see whether we can change the conversation about coronavirus by just asking some different questions. So you've obviously gone through challenging times before, and everybody has. So tell me a story about a challenging time you've gone through where you came out at the end sort of triumphantly and you thought, yeah, I got through that. In the end, it was okay. And any story you like at any time, it's fine. Yeah. You can't do anything wrong.
No, one immediately comes to mind, and it's from probably, I want to say more than 15 years ago now. I used to work in the social services sector, sector I like to call the social profit sector. Many people call it the nonprofit sector. And I was an executive director with a child, youth, and family serving agency. And the government at the time had been elected on an austerity program and announced that they were going to make 43% cuts in our sector. and so our programs and services were going to be slashed drastically, was the initial word. And I just didn't want to have to, kind of spend most of my time in that environment contemplating, how we were going to slash programs. And so I reached out to some colleagues that I had a great deal of trust in. I asked them if they'd be interested in looking at what we could do that was different and something that perhaps would allow us to feel like we were building something as opposed to negatively restructuring something. And they were all up for it. And so we came together, and 6 different organizations. We had a university college involved as well, and started talking about what it would look like to build a program that was brand new in the midst of this time when they were talking about 43% cutbacks. And we spent several weeks, meeting and talking and bringing in frontline people, because the people I brought together were other managers, other leaders. But we wanted the input from frontline people who knew what was needed in the community more than we did. And eventually we put together a proposal that we took to the government. And in a time when they were looking at 43% cutbacks, they were willing to find, an extraordinary amount of money in new money that they were going to give to the 6 of us to work in our regions relative to this new project. And, that would have been a great story if that actually had have happened. At the time, we were told that if we came up with a plan where over time, our reliance on government industry, government generosity rather, went from, the full amount to 0 amount. And we came up with a plan that by the time the 4th year was over, we would be self-sustaining. And the government said, that's exactly what we're looking for. We want to see that kind of private-public partnership, they were calling it. And so we put the proposal together. They came back and they said, here's our offer. We'd like you to do it. And then they told us that they would like us to be self-sustaining after the 1st year. And we knew that that wasn't possible. We knew if we took the money from them, which they were offering, and then started this up in the community, and then had to shut it down after 1 year, that would do more harm to the community than good. And as strange as it may seem, we said, well, it's not strange that we turned down the money. I think that was an just a thing that we had to do. But the strange part is that I did feel triumphant about that, because as a group, we stayed true to the values that we had relative to what that program was about and what the community needed at the time, which was, a program that could be counted on for the long term, not simply a cash grab for, a short period of time. So it was an amazing project. It was an amazing proposal. And interestingly enough, in the years since, I've seen that proposal pop up in other communities where, they've put the ideas that we had drafted so many years ago into place in various communities around the province. So that particular circumstance, that particular work that we did, even though it didn't have what one would call a successful outcome at the time, seemed to actually have some input over time for many communities.
Yeah, so it had a really tremendous impact, even if in the short term it was a bit disappointing. Terrific.
Yeah.
So what do you think was the secret that helped you and the others actually pull this off?
I think the key one was the level of trust that we had in one another. Quite often, organizations in government-funded sectors are pitted against one another in competitions, put in a proposal in order to get this money to provide that service for your community. There was none of that in this instance, and I think what happens when you get involved in those competitive bid processes is people shut down. You're for fear of giving away one of your best ideas that your competitor is going to put in their proposal and then win the competition. People keep their best ideas close to their chest. And so what what I think was really helpful in that situation was nobody felt like they had turf to protect. We brought in people from the front lines and we asked them to share openly what they thought the best practices were relative to the subject matter we were discussing. And they gave us, their ideas wholeheartedly. I mean, it didn't matter that there were other organizations sitting in the room. There was no turf to protect. It was simply about how can we provide the best possible service for clients in our respective communities. And I think that what really made that happen was the level of trust that existed between the organizations, and in particular us as the leaders of our organizations, because our people came in with the same level of trust. They came in saying, I'm going to share everything I've got, and we're going to have a real good, honest dialogue about it all. I think the other piece that helped was that people shared whatever resources they could. I was able to share a meeting place for us to come together. Another organization, they flew their executive director down to Vancouver on a number of different occasions for us to have the meetings. Another gentleman drove 5 hours to get to the meetings every time we had one. We got stuck at one point and decided that we were going to bring in a facilitator to help us out. And another of the leaders sitting around the table said, I've got some extra money, I'll pay for the facilitator. So, there were just a variety of different resources that people brought that allowed us to continue the conversations. And I think the last piece was just the positive intent that everybody had sitting around the table. I didn't for a moment believe that people were there for any other reason than to create the best possible community they could, and create the best possible resource they could for the people that they were serving.
So what were the particular skills or contributions that you made to this, to creating this what seems like an amazing atmosphere of cooperation and mutual trust and creativity and generosity?
Yeah.
And don't be modest.
Yeah, please. I think I'm a pretty good facilitator for bringing people together. I'll have the germ of an idea, and typically they are ideas that I think at some level other people have as well. But I'll bring it out and say, what if we thought about, and I'm not too worried about being told, well, that's not a great idea. If it's not a great idea, fine. I'll take it as such. In fact, one of my colleagues said that, Bill, if you have 100 ideas, and think of them as toast, and 96 of them pop out of the toaster burnt, they're probably not worth looking at, but the 4, man, are those worth waiting for. And I've always hung on to that quote. That quote's been one that really has stuck with me. And so I've never felt like, okay, I've had 50 in a row that were burnt, I need to stop. It's always been, just throw them out there and see what happens. So that, I think, was the real key in terms of my contribution. I think the contributions that others were making relative to that process were equally important. And I think that what they brought was just an incredible generosity of spirit, a willingness to think beyond themselves, to take really the focus to be on their communities and what was best for the communities, and not necessarily who was going to end up delivering it, but for the most part, it was that generosity of spirit that really stood out for me, and the level of honesty and the integrity, frankly, of those people. Part of why I reached out to them was I knew all of them to be people of integrity, people that would respond in ways that benefited community, as opposed to looking to first support their agency. It was more about supporting their communities.
You could consider all those qualities as being possibly true of you.
Well, thank you.
Integrity, generosity of spirit, being willing to try things, and not getting defensive, not worrying about whether your ideas get accepted first of all, or just keep going modestly.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
So let's imagine it's it's a few years' time, maybe 2, maybe more, and thinking about this crisis that we're all facing at the moment, which is the coronavirus pandemic. And let's imagine that we've somehow or other collectively we've actually come through this. And we're also thinking, well, we came to that pretty well, actually. It's turned out all right. Actually, we've come through it triumphantly. So, and let's imagine it's a couple of years' time, 3 years or whatever, and just like to sort of imagine it's that date now, and tell the story to a sort of intelligent 10-year-old about, okay, this is what actually happened.
It all starts with conversation, with communicating with one another. I don't believe that things can change unless we have the conversation. So, my 10-year-old friend, what happened was we began to have real conversations, ones that we shared honestly our hopes and dreams for what we wanted our life and our planet to look like. And that started by each individual person being honest with themselves, and having a look at what was going to work for them long term. I think many of us have gotten used to a particular lifestyle, and there are others on this planet who really are in the majority, who haven't had the lifestyle that we've had. And so being able to honestly accept that, and being able to say what is truly necessary and meaningful to us is, I think, an important first start. And I think that the key is relative to this communication is to take it beyond the kind of inner circle that you have. To take the risk, if you will, to move outside of yourselves, to take the conversation to that next level, and to be able to to say to people, there are exemplars in our communities that we can use to help us understand how to move forward. So in our case, I think it's a continued emphasis on respect for one another. The way that in the jurisdiction I live in, the way things have been handled is treating people as conscious, sentient adults who will make the right choices if you give them the opportunity to gently educate them about what needs to happen in order for the changes to occur. The leader, the provincial health officer, saying, what needs to happen, and doing it in a calm, respectful kind of way without threatening overtones, and without saying, look, if you don't handle things in a particular kind of way, all kinds of dire consequences are coming your way. So being able to continue to have those conversations about what we need to do in order to move forward, and respecting one another to make that happen. So I think what we've done in the last 2 years is to create environments in which people can reasonably say to one another, here's what needs to happen, here's what all of our responsibilities are, and for people to follow through. It's one thing to talk about it, but the real critical piece in terms of implementing change is the action. So the action is really something that's a critical piece there.
So tell me a story about a meeting that happened as part of this process. So maybe something which you thought, well, yes, if we had more things like this, and they were happening all over, this really would make this is part of the process of making a difference.
I think it's the ongoing education piece. We've been clear about what needs to happen. We've been helping provide people with the resources. You know, television stations have been running regular town halls, as they have been doing here actually, but they continue it beyond the crisis mode. So it's not simply something that we do because we're in crisis, which is why I think they started, but we do them because it's the right thing to do to keep educating people, to keep them aware of the latest developments. So for instance, if we're moving towards a vaccine, what does that mean? And providing people with the information they need in multiple ways, because we know that, you know, different people respond to different forms of communication. So being able to take that old advertising adage, you know, whatever you think the appropriate number of times to tell people are, triple it. And to do that in a way that allows, you know, young people, middle-aged people, older people to really get the message, you know, and do it in a calm, respectful way that, you know, we've been able to help people to understand what does it take to you know, eradicate the virus, and also to start taking into account some of the things we've learned about ourselves, and making the changes that we've been making kind of, well, we have to make it because of the virus. You know, what are some of the things that we want to do permanently, you know, and having conversation about, you know, what those things are, as opposed to, you know, going back to the old ways of doing things, which I think is, you know, the hope of some people, is that we can get back to the old normal. And that doesn't mean that, you know, that I never want to go to a concert or a sporting event or whatever again. But I think that there are other pieces to the puzzle that we need to talk about on a, you know, kind of with a long-term vision in mind.
So this is open conversations across communities about what sort of world do we really want, and people in a space where every view gets treated with, gets heard. That's what I hear you saying. I hope I've got that right.
Yeah, with dignity and respect, I think is those are the two words that come to mind for me.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, how would you feel if you, knowing that you've instigated that and it's catching on rather, and it's happening all over the place? How would you feel knowing that you were instrumental in that? How do you feel knowing you're instrumental in that?
I guess I'd feel ecstatic and that my time on the planet was well spent. You know, I mean, it would be, you know, tremendous feeling that you help to, you know, move that process along, and at the same time knowing that that it's going to take a lot of people. I think it was Helen Keller, and I'm going to bastardize the quote, I'm sure, but you know, she talked about, you know, the fact that we need great leaders, but it's through the efforts of many followers that we have the opportunity to make great things happen. And I really think that that's something that we need to pay attention to, that that leadership comes from all of us, right? And we all have an opportunity to step into those roles, and it's the job of the people with the titles of leader to sort of allow that to happen. You know, the people at the top never have all the best ideas. And so how do we allow people, you know, who typically have this title of follower to step into the role of leadership and be able to, you know, offer their thoughts, their ideas, their resources in terms of making change.
So, what did other people do to help these changes, these change conversations, these more inclusive and deeper and more far-reaching conversations?
The first thing is that they recognize that, you know, that first conversation was like a stone going in the water and it ripples outward, but it's a finite, you know, part of the you know, lake that takes over. It's going to take many stones thrown into the lake in order for the ripples to cover the entire lake. And so I think, you know, that we've seen our role as being helping other people to start conversations. And again, it's because, you know, we have a finite amount of knowledge and expertise, and we need to create the conditions that allow other people to, you know, use their knowledge and expertise and start a new ripple that never would have happened with us alone.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you have my permission and encouragement.
You bet.
So what's how let's suppose this has all happened and these conversations have happened. What sort of positive changes are you noticing? Let's imagine it again. Imagine it is 3 years time or 2 years time, and you're sitting in, you know, you're still living where you are, and you've maybe just gone out and met a few folks, and you're on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday,
Yeah.
and some things are different, and you've noticed they're different. What have you noticed?
Well, I think I'm going to start to notice them in myself. I think that, you know, we're kinder and filled with more gratitude for what we have as opposed to what we strive to have. You know, I think it's easy to get caught up in what you don't have and striving to achieve that, as opposed to, you know, appreciating what you do have. And so, you know, that sense of you know, calmness, of you know, contentment, I think would be top for me in terms of, you know, feeling states. And just, you know, I guess the words that just keep coming are things like feeling serene, you know, and you know, having some sense of my place in the world, and that I'm just one little pebble here, along with the other pebbles that are really important to me, and that and that we can, you know, have a sense of generosity of spirit, and you know, inclusiveness, and you know, a sense of wanting people to come together as being really central to our being, and you know, just finding that, you know, our communities are more than, I think we've become really kind of single family oriented, and we're not as connected to community perhaps as we could be, and so I think that maybe there's a stronger sense of connection to the community as well.
What's one small thing you think you might do in the next month, or few week, next short time, to move this idea forward a bit?
I think it's to continue to have conversations with the people that I know who have this kind of appreciative mindset, and you and I both have been part of the appreciative community for many years, and so developed a lot of people around us, and so, you know, having the conversations about how can we, you know, start these opportunities. I think you know, initially putting these questions up on LinkedIn, that's where I saw them and responded to you, and I think that was an incredibly important first step, and so I think getting people to begin the conversations in various parts of the world. There you are in the UK, and here I am on the west coast of Canada. You know, we've started 2 little ripples here. How can we get those ripples to spread out in other communities where people, you know, begin to have the conversations? Because I think when people start to think differently, and they start to have conversations with others, that our political leaders begin to hear that and they respond to it. And I'd like to believe that they take it on proactively, but I think for the most part, it's in response to people like us having conversations that say, look, this is the type of leadership we're looking for. Who's willing to provide it for us?
What's your best idea, Bill, about how to, you know, how to create more of these, not necessarily using a precise framework, but have more conversations like this happening?
I think it has to involve mainstream media, you know, and by mainstream media, I don't mean just, you know, television stations and radio stations and so forth, but there are so many bloggers and people with podcasts and, you know, so many ways of reaching out to people, and it's not necessarily their innate way of talking or thinking coming from an appreciative standpoint. So the idea for me is, how can we find some of these influential people who either are already, you know, oriented towards an appreciative stance, and groups like Huffington Post and Axiom News come to mind as a starting point, just off the top of my head, and get them to you know, look at this as not an episodic story, but something that we need constant repetition of in order for it to become part of the general populace's consciousness. And so, as much as I think that it's great that you and I are able to do something like this, and there'll be some people who hopefully watch our videos and say, you know, that's a great start, let me take something on like that as well. I really think we need to reach out to some of those groups that have the ability to make it something more than a one-off issue that, you know, runs through, I forget what the news term is, a news cycle. You know, it needs to be something other than a news cycle. It needs to be something that we're constantly talking about.